Today I wanted to take a look at Yennefer Conjurer. I mentioned in a video the other day that she was one of my favorite cards. She and Great Oak are my favorite cards. And let's talk about Yennefer Conjurer here. This is a card I used to run quite a bit. Back when you could still carapace neutral cards. You could carapace this and keep it alive. And use it as a big engine card in Monsters. Now, Monsters isn't really the best faction for it, thanks to the obvious. But let's talk about the card before we get into what we can do with it. So, she's a 9 provision unit with 5 power. Zeal Order, Human Mage. Deal 1 damage to the highest enemy unit's cooldown 1. So, the obvious thing you want to be doing is zapping a whole bunch of units with the same power. So the reason this is good, potentially, is if they have like 10 units that are like 10 power, for example. And then you play her, you zap them all, and then this next turn they're all 9. So you zap them all again. You're getting like 10 points a turn of value from this. However, that's rarely going to happen. And if it is going to happen, she's only 5 power, so she's easily removed. She needs protection. And yeah, so that's not really going to work out. But let's talk about a couple things you can do with her before we talk about the issues. So first of all, she has some really good synergies with damage engines. So targeted damage engines, by the way, not random damage engines. Like, for example, the Dwarf Berserker. You know the one I'm talking about, the guy who pings away at everything. Like, this guy is not the greatest synergy because he's doing random damage. And you want to target the damage to make all of the opponent's units the same power as Yennefer. So, much better than that is something like a Ballista. The Reinforced Ballista. Something like, not that one, like this one. The Ballistas can come out here, you can zap them with the Ballistas, hit them down to all about the same power, then Yennefer starts blowing out the whole board. That's the idea you could do with her. And in theory, that's actually pretty good. The issue comes in to, if you're setting this up, you're not killing units. If you're not killing units, so for example, I have Reinforced Ballista and Caro Ballista, I could kill something or could set up a bunch of things to the same power. If you're setting things up to the same power, they're gonna kind of know that you're playing Scorch or Igni or something like that. Well, they'll think you're doing that and play around it. So they're going to try and avoid having everything the same power. And if you start trying to set it up, they'll probably try and prevent you. And once they start trying to stop it from working, it's not going to work very well. The thing is, like I said, you're not killing units. So if they're playing engine cards, you're pinging them all down to the same power for Yennefer, you're not killing those engine units. And they can keep getting value. But you can still do a lot of work here with something like this. When Yennefer works, she works very well. And you can get a lot of value from her. So that's basically, she only has that one use, right? You get a whole bunch of things the same power, and you just get insane value from her ability. How do we do that? Well, before we talk about any more negatives, let's talk about some things you can actually do to make Yennefer somewhat work. The biggest thing is you need protection when using Yennefer. So there's a couple ways to do this. Like I said, you can carapace. Previously, you could carapace, right? So let's look at carapace here. Boost an ally unit by 3. If it's a monster's unit, also give it Veil. So you could boost her by the 3 like you do with Ciri, but she won't get the Veil. And the Veil is really key here. When I say you can't put Carapace on her, I mean like a Carapace doesn't give her Veil, which is kind of important because you want to avoid her getting locked. There's a couple other protective options you can use with Yennefer. The biggest one being the Shield Wall. So Shield Wall is an ability that can actually protect engines pretty well. So like your Anna, the one that boosts everything next to her, the adjacent units, that can work. Theoretically, you could use something for Royal Inspiration, but the one boost isn't worth it on her. But really, it's going to be Shield Wall. You're going to have the Carapace, and you're going to have Guerrilla Tactics isn't bad either. 2 puts her to 7. It's nice. You can do that. And I think that's most of the ones, other than, of course, you could Imperial Formation for that +2 as well. So there's a couple options to use when boosting her up. And you can actually use cards as well. So one card that comes to mind, well, type of card, is the Defender cards. If you're running the Yennefer and you want to use her, you probably want a Defender to keep her alive. Not this guy, though, because he doesn't protect her at all. Probably want one of these to protect her. That's usually a good idea. And something else you could do is, if you want to, you can try out the Wyvern Scale Shield. Give her a shield when you play her. This one's much more situational, but if you're running her in a Shield Wall type deck, you could go with this. The only issue there being Shield Wall doesn't have the most damage. So yeah, where does she work best then? Now we've talked about like how you want to use her. Well, there's a couple ones. Probably the best faction is Northern Realms. Usually with Shield Wall, Inspire Zeal gives you a 2-point boost too, but she's not a Northern Realms unit, so you can't do that. Shield Wall is probably the best because it protects her, and you can also run a bunch of Northern Realms engines, and the Northern Realms engines have the most targeted damage in the game, which really helps her. So that is something you can do as well. Like, she works pretty well if you can get this set up here. The thing is, usually you want to run the Golden Necker Shield Wall decks with Erendite the last patch. And it's worth mentioning, if you want to run a Golden Necker deck, she can actually fit in there. She's a 9 provision card now, so you could run her in a Golden Necker deck with Shield Wall if you want to. Just those decks tend to be more focused around the Witchers and Shields, and they don't run a lot of damage engines. So you'd probably have to make some kind of special deck for her. You can't just throw her in there, but it's worth mentioning that the Shield Wall works pretty well. And if we're looking at the Northern Realms units here, that's Syndicate. We look at Northern Realms units, and we just type in damage. We'll get an idea of what I'm talking about here, right? Like, we have so many cards that deal damage. You've got Lyrian Arbalist if you're playing cards charged with orders. You've got Reinforced Ballistas, obviously being the best one. You've got regular Ballistas. You've got Kara Ballistas. You've got Ordanian Archers you can go with as well if you want to go with this route. And there's a lot of ways to get Bronze Engines going that can just keep pinging away at stuff to set up Yennefer. So Northern Realms is a pretty good option. Nilfgaard can kind of be as well if you're going to go with the Soldier route, although it's more random damage, right? So if we look at the cards here, you've got the Soldiers that can do damage. So if you're playing a Spying deck, you could use Enforcers. Not the biggest fan of that one. But if you're playing regular Soldiers, you've got like Alba Pikemen, you've got your Crossbows. You have a fair amount of random damage, which is less good than targeted damage, but you've got special cards. You could run something like Fire Scorpion if you're running Tactics. It could work, but I think Northern Realms is a bit better. And then the last one we mentioned was Guerrilla Tactics. Also has some decent options, but again, most of their damage is random pinging, right? So it doesn't set up Yennefer super well. So like you have a couple options here if you want to go with like an engine-based deck with Boar and Pavko. I wouldn't recommend that, but there are a lot of somewhat damaging elf cards. So you've got things like the Archer here, the Bowman here. You've got the Archer. You've got, if you want to throw in some of these other cards. The thing is, they're all deploys. There's not really a consistent engine one outside of the Elven Swordmaster. So that's really it, because you don't really want to run the Berserker for the pinging. The Nilfgaard, we mentioned the ping, so they have more options for it. But usually here you just have the Swordmaster, so it's not the best option. And then there's one more we wanted to talk about, Monsters with Carapace. Monsters is probably the weakest just because they don't have damage cards, right? Like, Monsters doesn't really have damage engines. They're all about point slam and thriving and stuff like that, getting their own engines going. So she doesn't work super well there. But there are a couple of neutral options you could run with her. But again, I don't think they're as strong. So obviously you could go with something like Synthesis Blaze sets her up quite nicely. But again, that's not a great card in general. That's not awesome. So it's kind of hard here to set up because most of the things that do damage in neutrals, the ones that are kind of decent are row damage effects. And there's not really great ways to set her up. So that's kind of her issue. Now we've kind of talked about how to use her. Let's talk about the issues with her. Last thing to mention here before getting to this though is Nilfgaard. I said that they have options outside of just the damage pinging. It's from stuff like Nilfgaardian Knight where it boosts the opponent's units, right? You can boost them up to the same power. Just want to quickly mention that. But as far as Yennefer's weaknesses, there's several. And the biggest one is just that the setup for her to be good doesn't happen very often. That's the issue, right? You want the opponent to have a bunch of units with the same power, but that doesn't happen very often. So that's it, right? If they're just playing a bunch of units, they're not going to be the same power. So you have to set up the pinging down for that. Previously, you could do this with stuff like the engines, but you can still do this with stuff like Ballista engines, but it's not the easiest thing to set up. And whenever you try and set it up, the opponent's going to think you're running Igni or Scorch. And when they think you're running Igni or Scorch, they're going to play around it. And whenever they play around it, she's only doing 1 point a turn, and that's just not good enough. So that's the biggest issue, is that due to the existence of Igni and Scorch, people really don't want stuff with the same power on a row. So they'll play around it, and then Yennefer's just doing 1 damage a turn, and she's really, really bad. That's the biggest problem with her, is that the setup for her to be good doesn't happen very often. If there was more ways to set it up, it would be a lot better, but there's just not a lot of consistent setup for Yennefer to be good. The best thing that could be added to the game for her, I think, is either something like a deck that really thrives in having everything the same power, or just like Scorch and Igni being removed, but that's not going to happen. So the best thing for her is, I think, to give her some kind of change to her ability, or just add a card that helps her set up better. Honestly, if she did 1 damage to the lowest units instead of the highest, it might be just better, because people would stop trying to play around it. But since it's the highest unit, they're thinking is Scorch Igni, and then they just play around it. If it's the lowest units, there's something to be said for everyone not caring that all their ones are getting zapped, but again, that's not really in this. I don't think that's in the spirit of what they want with a card, and it'd be kind of weird to target the lowest, but it would make her get more value, I think. But I don't think it would be good still. I think she needs some kind of, I don't know. It's hard to say with her because her potential is obviously really high. Like, in theory, if they just play a bunch of Arachna Swarm drones and start boosting them, you can get like 10 points a turn off of her. But that's not going to be happening. So it's hard to say what to do with her, because even if she's getting like 2 points, even at 2 points a turn, they have to have 2 units out already. They have to be the same power, and you have to have Yennefer going. They have to not kill her. So it can't be like the first couple turns of the round, because you have to protect her. But even at 2 cards a turn, she's only okay. Like 2 points a turn engine for 9 provisions isn't great. Like, it's not terrible, but it's not bad. Like, if it's 3 or 4 points a turn, then we're talking, but you have to wait so long in the round to get that going that it's not going to happen very consistently. And at that point, you're probably getting hit by their engine stuff too. So I'm not sure how to change her. Honestly, if you want to keep the ability of highest units, so like have all this value, I don't think there is a way to change her effectively. But maybe if you want to do like deal 1 damage to the 2 highest enemy units, but then again, you don't get the sick payoff of her blowing up a board. So it's hard to say what to do with her, which is kind of the problem. I think she just needs some kind of synergy. Like some other cards to set her up better. And that's kind of hard to see happening. The only thing that I will mention here is, where is the Witcher guy? Ivo. So Ivo of Belhaven is a neutral dude. He's got this ability here, damage enemy by 2, cooldown 1. Cooldown 2. Whenever you play Witcher, reduce the cooldown by 1. If there were more cards like this, potentially in neutral, that had a damage engine value, maybe you could make them work with Yennefer. But as she is, I just don't see a good way to use her, which is really unfortunate, because like I said, she's one of my 2 favorite cards in the game. Probably slightly edges out Grey Oak, if we're honest here, but really just don't have a great way to use her. What do you guys think about Yennefer? Am I underestimating the potential she has? Can you actually get her to set up to work? What do you guys think? How would you like to see her changed? And what card do you guys want to see next time? That'll be it for this one, guys. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. And you can check out some more videos over here. And thanks for watching.